What do you see when you imagine a politician? This variety of politician may not have topped your list. In the Manitoba of the 1980s, a new wave of rural politicians decided they needed a voice in government. One of them was Glen Cummings, a mixed farmer in the Neepawa area, who surprised many, including himself, by becoming the MLA for St. Rose in the election of 1986. He would repeat this electoral success in the next 5 consecutive elections. Glen Cummings believes that anytime you scratch a farmer, you'll find a politician. It helped that, as a child, his parents had always shared their interest in the news and in public affairs.
Well, farm politics. I mean, there's no industry that has more interest in its own self-preservation in many respects than agriculture. It's a cornerstone industry, and farm politics, all the way from farmers' union to more modern joint representation through keystone agricultural producers, and then pork producers, beef producers. Each commodity has a group of people who want to promote the commodity and promote the well-being of that commodity and promote the understanding of it, frankly, because as we become more urbanized, and that's pretty evident in Manitoba because we have one extremely large center and a number of smaller centers across the province that are mainly agricultural. So we used to feel that we needed to promote ourselves, frankly, to not just to each other, but to the larger world. Grew beyond just talking to our city neighbors, but talking about international trade. If you want a lively discussion, get a group of farmers talking about international trade. How quick can you get a fresh pork into Japan? Where's the next market for wheat? Development of new crops, and whether or not they'll be profitable. All those things are pretty common topics of conversation in modern agricultural circles.
He knew a lot about farming, and he had a flair for leadership. That was developed as a youth in 4-H and with local agricultural groups. When a local school trustee resigned his seat on the Beautiful Plains School Board, Glen decided to go for it.
So I became involved in the school board, mostly not because I was looking for a job, but because the retiring trustee said, "I'm not going to run again, why don't you?" Well, getting elected on the school board was just a matter of finding 10 people or 20 to sign your nomination papers. But I became quite involved and quite interested, and within a couple of years I was the chairman of the board. Whether that was a good thing or not, it certainly whetted my appetite in the political process, because we had quite an aggressive management group in the Beautiful Plains School Division, and we got involved in some of the provincial issues, made presentations at the legislature, and of course that was even bigger thing for a farm board. We go into the legislature and making a presentation, even though it turned out it was 2 o'clock in the morning at a committee. The only one that was listening was me and the Minister of Education at that time. I think everybody else was trying to wake up, but it was actually where I got the most interested in bigger picture politics.
The big picture looked pretty grim for farmers when Cummings was first elected in 1986.
Well, the 80s was the era of very high interest rates, which destroyed a lot of dreams of a good many young farmers, and some older ones for that matter. It brought home the risk factor that was involved in agriculture, and the inability to control that risk unless you just sunk into the woodwork and didn't have an aggressive operating style. You were going to feel the pain of those very expensive interest rates. In today's climate, if you think about 18 to 20% interest on loans, You know, if that happened to most household loans today, big percentage of them would collapse. No reflection on the people that have them, but it's just there's no margin left after you take 20% out of it for an operating loan. So that was the main factor. We had some mediocre prices for commodities at that time, and it was the beginning of the changes that we've seen for the last 30 years going through agriculture. And there has been no industry that's changed more than agriculture. You know, from the medium-sized operations to larger, more efficient operations, to where we now see more and more mega farms. That's not necessarily a swear word in the world, although there are many people who believe that very large farms are taking over more land than they should be. I believe that there's a balance that's still out there. There's a lot of very good, very efficient, medium-sized farms that in the 60s, when I was first starting to farm, would have been beyond what we thought would be possible because of technology and modern equipment now. Even a medium-sized farm operation is very efficient, and if they're well run, they're a very good operation for the community.
Manitoba farmers were deeply worried, and they demanded a serious voice in provincial policies.
We were all involved in agriculture and wanted to see our families stay involved, and it was a driving force. And when we went to the legislature, we eventually made our voices known in specific changes. I don't know if we can say that there was one topic that we directly focused on, but we wanted to make sure that agriculture was heard from and that the future of the province had a big portion of agriculture in it, and the provincial policy should include that.
Glen Cummings was well regarded and popular among his legislative colleagues, and it wasn't long before Gary Filmon appointed him Deputy Minister and Minister of Municipal Affairs. Glen Cummings served in both opposition and in government, and defended perhaps more than his share of high-profile and controversial changes to life in Manitoba. One of them was the introduction of no-fault insurance for Manitoba drivers. It was a new idea, designed to get car accidents out of the convoluted, expensive legal system with new rules. But there was resistance.
The toughest sell was probably within caucus, because in many respects it went against the grain in terms of what most of my colleagues and even myself thought about the way insurance and regulation and matters of risk should be managed. But we were in a situation where Autopac seemed to have got out of control in terms of rising costs. And I remember one person quipping that people were getting whiplash from watching accidents.
One benefit of no-fault insurance was that it allowed younger drivers to afford car ownership, which even today is out of reach for young drivers in some other provinces. Cummings was also busy defending and enforcing new regulations to protect the environment. Recycling might sound pretty dull.
Well, it is pretty dull, but it gets exciting when you have to tell some municipalities that perhaps they should shut down their landfills. The two are connected. And that's what happened. We put in place regulations to provide for waste removal from the waste stream, things that were recyclable, tires and so on. We set in place regulation where the industry could move its focus on not just selling tires, but also taking them back and finding a final resting place for them after they're worn out. And it became one of the more successful recycling programs in the country. It also created a interesting dynamic. There were thousands and thousands of tires that had been left in the country.
From his youth onward, Glen Cummings had believed in the good sense of small government and minimal regulation. So it was something of a shock to see the number and variety of issues he was now expected to oversee, enforce, and update. This was especially true as environmental problems became more prominent. He recalls one Manitoba autumn when a smoke storm hit the city of Winnipeg.
One that I never anticipated being involved in was the fall that we had a huge smoke problem in the city of Winnipeg, because there was a very heavy crop and weather that was conducive to keeping smoke in the area, and there was a fair bit of stubble burning, you might say a lot of stubble burning, that was occurring in the areas close to the city of Winnipeg, and that smoke drifted into the city and caused a lot of trouble. And we did not previously have anything other than nuisance regulations to deal with it. And we ended up, the example that I personally had, if I looked down from a 20-floor apartment down to the street, you could barely see the street with the smoke that was below you. So it was certainly impacting in the community. There was fire alarms that were going off because of the smoke that was getting into areas that it shouldn't be. There was elevators that were being impeded on how they operated in some of the high-rise buildings. So all those things led to first of all, we had to have an emergency order to stop the stubble burning. But it led to that debate about what kind of environmental regulation makes it so that the people who are the operators and the people who are responsible for getting the work done could function, and yet the general population could be satisfied that they didn't have to have an undue amount of interruption to their lifestyle and their health, for that matter. And if you look at the premise that was put behind the stubble burning regulation, it didn't say thou shalt not burn. It said that you may burn under these conditions. And it took a while to convince our colleagues in rural Manitoba, because it was not just in the valley, it was all across Manitoba. It took a lot of people some time to appreciate that that was the way it was intended to work. There was a lot of laughter and anger in the agricultural community to begin with, but now it's been in place for quite a while, and some of the agriculture, in fact a lot of the agricultural practices have changed.
The pressure throughout his career seemed to intensify, but the MLA from St. Rose had an antidote for stress that very few of his peers could access.
I went home and drove the tractor for some time on the weekend. No, that actually was an outlet for me. It was completely different, but I did always carry a cell phone. And I have to admit that the final decision on selling the Manitoba Hazardous Waste Corporation to a private interest was a conversation that I had with the people who were doing the negotiating while I was sitting in the wheel well of my tractor in my field, talking to them on a cell phone. Modern technology allowed me to do a little bit of that. It didn't mean that I was not paying attention. It just meant that I was on the job 7 days a week sometimes.
Aspiring politicians in Manitoba and elsewhere can look to the long career of Glen Cummings for clues on how to win elections in spite of managing a multitude of very thorny issues.
Well, I spent a lot of time traveling in the constituency. When I first began get involved in a bigger scale, I started campaigning for a full year before the election was called. So I traveled up into areas that were an hour and a half away from me, which were also in the constituency, up to Crane River, Rorton, Tootsade. One of the things I used to tease some of my colleagues about in the legislature, did you know where Bacon Ridge and Silver Ridge are? And why don't you? I mean, those were two communities in the north part of my constituency that needed to get to be known in. Now, I was involved with my father in purebred livestock, and I got to know some of the livestock producers, or had a reputation with some of the livestock producers in the northern part of the constituency, which is a big cattle area. And that allowed me to have an intro into the area and talk to people. And I was able to forge some very strong connections with certain members of the community, and they stuck by me, fortunately. You know, there's a difference in a rural constituency in those days than what there might be in an urban constituency then and now. If you had people in the area that were known in the area that would go out and actually work for you, that was a big factor in terms of people starting to feel like they actually knew you. And my policy in my office and for myself was, if somebody had a letter or a phone call that they made into the office, that they would get a phone call back. Had to have, as an example, one fellow who lost his driver's license, and I said, well, you got to give me permission to look at your transcript. I said, I really can't do anything about it. And I phoned him back, and I had to tell him, you know, if I had final say on this, I wouldn't give you your driver's license back either. I think he still voted for me, though, because he knew that I at least looked at it and decided that he had nothing to complain about. But
Would Glen Cummings take it all on again?
oh, definitely. But one thing that I would stress is you need to be willing to approach the job with an open mind. Those who have I had a reason to get involved, but I also knew at the time that I needed to represent more than just my own narrow interests. We had businessmen, we had teachers, we had professionals all across the constituency. We had a lot more than agriculture going on, and I needed to have a relationship with the other people as well, or you can't represent them.
As fast as you can. Take this doll and hold it on tight. And you say these words in the middle of the night. Too bad you are born. Too bad you are born. Hear him shout from his bayou door. These voodoo powers don't play with these. As your boat goes slowly through the bayou trees.